Well, disappointment and disgust. That's how former patients of a teen psychiatric center are reacting to the news that Sequel Pomegranate has resumed treating children.
Now, the state effectively shut down that facility back in December, citing a reoccurring pattern of problems that 10 investigates as repeatedly exposed that left both staff and kids hurt. Here's Chief Investigative Reporter Bennett Haverly with the explanation from the state on how the center is again treating vulnerable children.
The signage on the front window has been removed, but for some, the memories of what happened behind these walls are hard to shake.
This whole situation is gut-wrenching.
I had threats of restraints. I was left in the seclusion room for overnight. It was maybe like 18 hours in the seclusion room without food, without a bed.
These former patients of Sequel Pomegranate, a teen psychiatric and behavioral treatment center, say they were alarmed to learn the facility has resumed treating children after the state effectively shut the facility down in December.
Can y'all wait in the lobby real quick while I run and check it out?
Certainly.
That decision was driven by what the state called a recurring pattern of incidents.
The suspect headbutted her and then punched her in the face once.
I thought you got hit in the face.
That was me.
Including police runs for fights that left staff hurt and documented complaints from children who alleged they too were harmed, either through improper restraints or abuse. But even after Sequel Pomegranate relinquished its residential behavioral license in December, it held on to the license for its acute hospital, even though the state had previously threatened to revoke it as well. This business filing from the Secretary of State's office shows the facility now uses a new name, Torrey Behavioral Health, and resumed treating a handful of children earlier this year. This week, we showed up unannounced and spoke briefly to the facility's CEO. So it's still, you guys are still owned and operated by Sequel Youth and Family Services, but you're doing business as Torrey Behavioral Health.
Exactly. It's still Sequel Pomegranate.
Right. The new CEO told me he couldn't answer questions and referred me to the parent company, Sequel Youth and Family Services, which has experienced problems with its other facilities across the country, including a now closed center in Michigan where a 16-year-old boy died last year after being restrained by staff.
I worry this will bury the large body of evidence we have that shows Sequel Pomegranate failed youth in its care.
It's extremely disappointing to hear, but it's not necessarily surprising to hear.
We took their concerns to Lori Chris, the head of the Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services, which licenses Sequel Pomegranate. But it doesn't appear as though you guys are holding them to account. I mean, you've allowed them to continue to operate when they've been incident after incident that you guys said was unacceptable. So how can you say you guys are doing your job?
Yeah, no, we are. We are holding Sequel Pomegranate to account. The same corporations operating it.
Chris explained the facility may have the same parent company, but they are still under state monitoring and have incrementally increased the number of patients they treat. You guys saw a repeated pattern of concerns. You suspended the operations, and now here they are operating again. I mean, what would you guys say to past patients who are sickened by that?
We understand their concerns, we listen to, hear their concerns, and we're monitoring to ensure that there are protocol in place, procedures are being followed so that those things don't happen again.
But past residents we spoke to worried this name change will make it more difficult for parents of new patients or placement agencies to be aware of the incidents from the past.
My fear right now is that this could allow Sequel to save face and sidestep legitimate public concern over their abuses. It's frankly misleading.
Bennett Haverly, 10 Investigates.
Sequel Youth and Family Services sent us a statement that did not answer or address our questions about if the facility was changing its name to move away from its troubled past. That statement did read, in part, quote, "The name change reflects the meaning of Torrey, representing a gateway marking the transition from the mundane to the sacred. Patients are encouraged to enter for treatment and continue down the road with us to a restorative place of health, strength, and a feeling of well-being." 10 Investigates also requested an interview with the new CEO, but we have not yet heard back just yet. 2 years after 10 Investigates first started uncovering problems at a psychiatric facility for teens, that facility, formerly known as Sequel Pomegranate, tells the state it's now closing.
And no explanation was given, but there is a long history inside that facility of violence, sexual abuse, and other incidents that raise questions about the care being provided there.
Tonight, Chief Investigative Reporter Bennett Haberly has reaction from those who once spent time on the inside.
The parking lot is nearly empty, but the memories of what happened inside this teen psychiatric facility are still packed in the minds of those who had experiences at the place once called Sequel Pomegranate.
What made it so bad?
Unjust seclusion and restraint. It was abusive in that way.
This woman, now in her 20s, asked not to be identified because of the sensitive nature of her diagnosis. She said she once struggled with thoughts of suicidal ideation, and during a 2-week stay here was placed in a seclusion room for crying. She told me staff threatened to place her in a restraint hold and that she watched it happen to other children.
It's always traumatizing. It's definitely traumatizing to see someone get restrained, not really be able to do anything about it, seeing like 4 or 5 staff members on top of like one 100-pound child is crazy to see.
Tracy Miller said her son endured physical trauma during his stay in 2018.
It's led to severe PTSD. We're still to this day, as you and I sit here, dealing with the trauma of what happened in that very short period of time at that facility.
Even now?
Even now.
Police could not substantiate her son's allegation that he was sexually assaulted. A hospital report noted a normal exam, but added that it does not negate the possibility of sexual assault. With no other available beds, Franklin County Children's Services sent him back to Pomegranate, where the next day she says her son was physically assaulted by a group of 10 teens.
Still trying to figure out how to overcome the trauma.
10 Investigate's review of police records and interviews with past residents, their families, and former workers have pointed to a recurring pattern of violence and abuse here.
Suspect headbutted her and then punched her in the face once.
Those problems continued in 2020, which prompted the state to threaten to revoke the facility's license. Pomegranate instead removed all children and kept open its acute hospital, rebranding itself as Torrey Behavioral Health. In its September 8th letter to the state, Torrey announced the closure of Sequel Pomegranate, adding that it was removing children and voluntarily relinquishing its licenses. It's welcome news to those we spoke to.
I'm really happy to hear that Sequel was shut down because I had a terrible experience there, and I know that it won't be happening anymore. Even though it was rebranded, sort of, I don't really trust Sequel facilities.
Sequel Youth and Family Services operates troubled teen centers across the country. Like Sequel Pomegranate, its other facilities have come under fire, like this one in Alabama that was found to have feces on the floor and other unsafe living conditions. And this Sequel facility in Michigan was shut down last year after a 16-year-old died after being restrained by staff.
10 Investigates reached out to Sequel's chairman and founder, looking for an explanation on why this facility is closing. There was no mention or explanation in the letter to the state. Tracy, by the way, says she has mixed emotions about this. On the one hand, she's happy this facility is closing. On the other, she knows it is now one less resource available for parents and children in need. In Columbus, Bennett Haberly, 10 Investigates.
Tonight, a national advocacy group has joined Paris Hilton in calling for change in a so-called troubled teen industry. National Disability Rights Network says there should be more oversight on these youth behavioral treatment centers.
The group cited 10 Investigates reporting on Sequel Pomegranate and problems at other facilities as evidence of why stricter regulations are needed. Here's Chief Investigative Reporter Bennett Haberly.
No children have been here for more than a month. Over the past 2 weeks, 10 Investigates watched as equipment and office furniture were removed from this once embattled behavioral treatment center for teens. Sequel Pomegranate, which rebranded itself as Torrey earlier this year, notified the state last month it planned to close its psychiatric hospital and voluntarily relinquish all of its licenses. No explanation was given, but admissions here and the money that followed have dramatically dropped off since early 2020, when Franklin County Children's Services stopped sending kids here, citing a pattern of problems. That move followed months of our reporting, which documented incidents of violence and abuse and stories from parents and children who expressed concern about how children were treated and restrained.
Do you think about the time you spent there?
Do you think about it a lot? Not anymore.
No.
I hate that place.
Another child we interviewed described how injections were given to some unruly kids to sedate them.
Like they'll lay you over on your side and then they'll like give it to your thigh. That's why they call it the booty juice.
And what does it do to kids who get it?
They go to like they just basically they'd be like we're gonna knock you out with the booty juice and they go straight to sleep.
Problems at other treatment centers operated by the parent company Sequel Youth and Family Services have led to closures at facilities in states like Utah, Wyoming, Illinois, and Michigan. But 10 Investigates has learned Sequel co-founder Jay Ripley has started a new venture called Vivint Behavioral Healthcare, which, according to this investment group website, plans to buy back a majority of Sequel Youth and Family Services properties. We found Vivint has filed business licenses to operate in at least 3 states: Arizona, Alabama, and Kansas. I called Ripley this week curious about if there are any future plans in Ohio, but haven't heard back. But the ability to close, rebrand, and potentially reopen a youth treatment center is part of what patient advocates say is a loosely regulated landscape.
It's not like whack-a-mole. They just pop up somewhere else. Because, again, there's money to be made here, at least the way they run these facilities. And so they're not walking away. They'll try to put, lipstick on a pig maybe by, changing the name or doing some kind of corporate, sleight of hand. But they make too much money to just walk away completely.
This week, Curtis Decker joined Paris Hilton outside the Capitol to call on members of Congress to pass legislation that would create a Bill of Rights for children in these facilities and further regulate the industry.
For 20 years, I couldn't sleep at night as memories of physical violence, the feeling of loneliness, the loss of peers rushed through my mind when I shut my eyes. This was not just insomnia, it was trauma.
Decker's group also issued a report which cited the work of 10 Investigates and calls for more oversight in an industry that makes millions treating vulnerable children. Bennett Haberly, 10 Investigates.
Former residents of an embattled youth behavioral treatment center want better protections for all children in congregate care. They also want the state of Ohio to cut all ties of Sequel Youth and Family Services. That's a parent company of Sequel Pomegranate, which closed this fall, 2 years after 10 Investigates first exposed incidents of violence and abuse. As Chief Investigative reporter Bennett Haberly explains, similar problems have led to more closures at other Sequel facilities across the country.
New Mexico State inspection found the injuries this child received happened when a staff member struck him with a tree branch. The behavioral youth treatment facility named in the report is owned and operated by Sequel Youth and Family Services and recently announced its closure in wake of allegations of abuse and neglect. It is one of several Sequel-owned facilities across the country that has closed in recent years amid allegations of abuse and other problems.
There are a number of just horrific problems that our monitors detected.
Earlier this month, we spoke to Carissa Tashiro with Disability Rights New Mexico. The nonprofit conducted its own investigation into Sequel's Bernalillo Academy.
And then there's just a rampant culture of peer-on-peer violence.
Here in Columbus, Sequel Pomegranate, which briefly reopened and rebranded itself as Torrey earlier this year, announced it would close in October. Our reporting uncovered a repeated pattern of allegations of violence and abuse here.
Assaulted our staff members.
With staff being injured by children, and children complaining of staff hurting them through painful restraint holds.
They put you in a hold. They put your hands behind your back until almost buckles.
They said that's the only way they can get their kids to calm down, they restrain them.
This reporting has been pivotal to back up what we've said all along.
Addison Torrance is a former resident at Sequel Pomegranate who is among a group of past residents now trying to persuade the state to sever all ties with Sequel and not allow the company to resume operating here.
The state is very receptive. I think they're wanting to work with us to prevent things like this from happening again. What happened at Pomegranate was horrendous. And at this point, nobody seriously disputes that.
I called the co-founder of Sequel again today, hoping to ask him about future plans for the company and his effort to rebrand Sequel under another name, but I haven't heard back.
I think that reporting has had a pretty significant impact.
This former resident asked that her identity be withheld, but says she too would like to see the state adopt additional safeguards for children so that history doesn't repeat itself. In Columbus, Bennett Haberly, 10 Investigates.
A spokesman for the Ohio Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services says while his department cannot make any obligations related to what Sequel may do in the future, it can commit to a thorough review, assessment, and discussion of changes that the state should consider to further ensure patient safety.